A veteran returned from war carrying a haunted past and a German shepherd, the only one who never abandoned him. At 49, David Miller believed his wife had left him and his family had erased him from their lives. Then a fallen brother left him a piece of land. But when the dog dug beneath the ashes, David discovered the truth. His wife never stopped loving him. Her letters were stolen. Now a corporation has 90 days to take the land. One man, one dog, and one last chance to prove he was never forgotten. Before we begin, please help me reach my first 1,000 subscribers and let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Your support truly means the world to us. Late autumn pressed cold air against the plains of Montana, the sky low and colorless. Wind slid through dry grass and rattled rusted metal, carrying the quiet weight of places long forgotten. David Miller woke inside a dented trailer that smelled of oil, dust, and old coffee. He was 49, tall but hollowed by years that had taken more than they returned. His shoulders still carried the broad lines of a soldier, but his posture sagged now, as if gravity itself expected less of him. His face was sharp and weather-worn, cheekbones prominent, jaw lined with untrimmed stubble already flecked with gray. His eyes, once steady and alert, were darker now, always scanning, never resting. David worked when he could, hauling scrap, fixing fences, digging trenches for people who didn't ask his name. He didn't complain. Complaining had never saved anyone. Max stirred beside him, rising before David fully sat up. The German shepherd was large, nearly 80 pounds, black and tan coat, dulled by time, but still thick and disciplined. His amber eyes tracked David's movements with practiced awareness. Max had been trained years ago, before everything fell apart, by David's wife. He moved with restraint, never jumping, never barking without reason. At 9 years old, his muzzle was beginning to gray, but his loyalty had not thinned. Max was the only living thing that woke when David woke, waited when David waited, and stayed when David stayed. David often thought Max remembered who he used to be better than he did himself. After the war, everything unraveled quietly. No dramatic collapse, no single explosion, just a slow erosion. David's wife, Sarah, had been a gentle woman with narrow shoulders and patient hands, her brown hair usually tied back in a loose knot, her skin pale from long hours indoors training dogs for service work. She believed in routines, in small mercies, in the idea that broken things could be guided back into usefulness. She believed in David longer than most, but the war followed him home. Nightmares, silence, anger he couldn't explain. Court papers came later. Custody followed them, then distance, then nothing. Sarah's family cut him off completely. Phone numbers disconnected, letters unanswered. David convinced himself she had chosen peace over him. It hurt less to believe that. By the time David reached Montana, he expected nothing from anyone. The trailer sat on the edge of a forgotten stretch of land, close enough to the road to hear passing trucks, far enough that no one stopped. He trusted work. He trusted Max. Everything else had failed him. When people looked at him, they saw a man who had lost. David saw someone who was still standing, if only out of habit. Survival had become mechanical. Eat, work, sleep, repeat. He didn't dream of better days. Dreaming required hope, and hope required risk. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, wedged crookedly in the trailer's mailbox, like it didn't belong there. Max noticed it first, stopping short, ears lifting. David frowned as he pulled it free. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, formal. His name was typed cleanly across the front. He hadn't received a letter that wasn't a bill in years. Inside, the paper was stiff, legal, precise. David read it once, then again, slower. A property, land, 40 acres in rural Montana, left to him by Lucas Reed. The name hit him harder than the cold ever had. Lucas Reed had been shorter than David, compact and strong, with close-cropped blonde hair and a grin that never quite disappeared, even under fire. He laughed too loudly, trusted too easily, and never hesitated when others froze. Lucas had been the one who pulled David from a burning vehicle, shoving him clear just seconds before the explosion. Lucas didn't make it out. David carried that weight home with him. He had never known Lucas owned land. He had never imagined Lucas thinking of him after death. David sat down slowly on the trailer step, the letter trembling slightly in his hands. Max pressed his head against David's knee, sensing the shift in his breathing. The land wasn't described as a farm, no house, no guarantees, just coordinates, a legal description, and a signature. David stared across the empty horizon and felt something unfamiliar stir beneath the exhaustion. Not hope, not yet. But a question. Why him? Why now? For the first time in years, the future didn't feel sealed shut. It felt unopened. And somewhere deep inside, beneath the guilt and the loss, David felt the quiet ache of something waiting. The land lay quiet under a pale evening sky, the kind of stillness that carried old damage rather than peace. David Miller stood at the edge of what used to be a house, staring at a rectangle of scorched earth where a life had once been built. Only the foundation remained, blackened stones half buried in weeds, as if the ground itself had tried to forget what happened here. A weathered storage shed leaned nearby, its wooden planks warped and silvered by years of wind. David felt no disappointment. Emptiness, at least, was honest. He spent the afternoon clearing debris, moving slowly, methodically, the way he had learned to work after the war, one task at a time, no room for thought. Max stayed close, circling the perimeter with quiet focus, nose low, tail steady. The dog's movements were deliberate, trained, familiar. As dusk settled, David dragged an old tarp into the shed and laid it across the cold floor. It wasn't comfort, but it was shelter. That night, the wind pressed, hard against the walls, carrying the smell of ash and dry grass. Max began digging just after midnight, not frantic, not playful, intent. His claws scraped against packed earth beneath the shed's loose floorboards. The sound pulled David from half-sleep. He watched as Max uncovered a rusted metal box, dented but sealed tight. David pried it open with a trembling hand. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were letters, dozens of them. Each envelope bore his name in handwriting he recognized instantly. Sarah's handwriting had always been neat, but soft, the curves of her letters careful, almost apologetic. She had been a slender woman, slightly shorter than David, with warm brown eyes that watched more than they spoke. Her hair, chestnut and fine, usually fell just past her shoulders unless tied back for work. She had spoken gently, even when firm, especially with the dogs she trained. Reading her words now, David felt her presence flood back with brutal clarity. The letters were written from the years he was overseas. They spoke of patience, of missing him, of believing he would come home. There was no anger in them, only hope. The final letter broke him. Sarah wrote of confusion, of messages she never received, of being told David no longer wanted contact, that the war had changed him beyond reach. She apologized for something she hadn't done. She said goodbye, believing she had already been abandoned. David's chest tightened as the truth formed with unbearable sharpness. Someone had taken these letters. Someone had decided, for both of them, that love was no longer allowed. Beneath the letters lay a single folded document, yellowed and creased. It was a photocopy of a legal application, incomplete but legible. Lucas Reed's signature clear at the bottom. The document described the land's intended use, temporary housing and rehabilitation space for returning veterans. The request had never been approved. No follow-up, no resolution. Lucas had planned something here. Something unfinished. David sank to the dirt floor, the letters spilling from his hands. His body shook, not with anger, but with grief sharpened by clarity. He had not been forgotten. He had been erased. The realization hollowed him in a way war never had. Max pressed against his side, solid and warm, resting his head on David's thigh. The dog's breathing was steady, grounding. For a long time David stayed there, surrounded by ashes and words that arrived too late. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red but clear. The loss had changed shape. It was no longer just pain. It was theft. David did not leave the next morning. The decision came quietly, without ceremony, as he watched the sun climb over the empty field where a house once stood. Something in him had shifted during the night. Leaving would have meant confirming every lie he had been forced to believe. Staying, even without a plan, felt like resistance. Max sat beside him, ears alert, posture calm, the steady presence of a dog that trusted a place before it trusted people. The nearby town was small enough that strangers were noticed immediately. At first, people watched David because of Max. The German shepherd's disciplined movements, the way he sat when spoken to, the calm intelligence in his amber eyes suggested training, history, purpose. Trust followed the dog before it followed the man. David began with simple repairs, clearing brush, reinforcing a sagging fence, coaxing water from an old hand pump well. His hands knew work. Years of military service and post-war labor had left them calloused and scarred, fingers thickened, knuckles slightly crooked. He spoke little, worked steadily, and paid for supplies with odd jobs offered cautiously, then more freely. One afternoon, an old man approached while David was repairing fence wire. His name was Harold Boone, a Vietnam veteran in his late 70s, tall but stooped, with a narrow face carved deep by time and sun. His gray beard was trimmed short, military neatness never fully leaving him. Harold's left leg dragged slightly, the result of shrapnel that never quite stopped hurting. He watched David work before speaking, voice rough but measured, the kind that rarely wasted words. He said the land had history, that Lucas Reed had talked about it years ago in the Legion Hall. "If this place was meant for veterans," Harold said, eyes fixed on the ground, "it can't be sold like ordinary dirt." The words settled heavily. Not advice, a warning. That night David opened Lucas's journal again. The notebook was thick, pages worn soft from years of handling. Lucas's handwriting was angular and precise, a reflection of the man himself, broad-shouldered, sharp-featured, intense but deeply principled. David remembered Lucas as quiet in crowds, fiercely loyal in the field, a man who believed promises mattered even when they cost you. The journal spoke of plans, meetings never attended, forms half-filled. Lucas wrote about creating a place where soldiers could breathe again, where no one would be treated as disposable after service. The land was never meant to be owned, it was meant to be held. As days passed, help came more openly. Martha Ellis, the town's postmistress, a middle-aged woman with cropped blonde hair and perpetually ink-stained fingers, quietly redirected mail, meant for Lucas's old address to David. She asked no questions, only nodded once, firmly. A mechanic named Joel, heavy-set with oil-darkened hands and a permanently furrowed brow, fixed David's generator in exchange for fence. Boards. No charity, only exchange, only dignity. David worked harder than his body wanted to allow. At night, exhaustion crept deep into his bones, but sleep came easier than it had in years. Max slept near the door, always facing outward, a silent guard. Reading Lucas's journal by lantern light, David began to understand the weight of what he had inherited. Not land, responsibility. The idea frightened him more than homelessness ever had. Standing at the edge of the property one evening, David felt the ground beneath his boots differently. This place had not waited for him, but it had not rejected him either. Lucas's words echoed clearly now. A promise delayed was still a promise. David closed the journal, jaw set, the first outline of purpose taking shape. If this land was meant to shelter those who had been left behind, then walking away was no longer an option. Mark Halstead arrived in a dust-gray pickup just after noon, parking with deliberate precision at the edge of the property as if the lines were already drawn. He was in his mid-40s, broad through the shoulders, with a square jaw darkened by stubble, and eyes that assessed before they acknowledged. His posture carried the imprint of military years, straight-backed, economical, careful not to waste motion. When he stepped out, his boots were polished but worn, the kind kept that way out of habit rather than pride. He introduced himself without offering a hand, voice level and practiced, explaining that he represented a regional development firm retained to clarify the status of the land. He spoke like a man reading weather, not delivering threats. They stood near the old well, Max positioned slightly forward of David, ears pricked, body still. Mark noticed the dog and nodded once, an unconscious gesture of respect. He said the numbers plainly. 90 days, back taxes, and legal fees accrued over years of neglect. If the balance wasn't paid in full by the deadline, the county would seize the land and place it into public auction. No extensions. No favors. David listened without interrupting, jaw set, hands resting against his thighs as if bracing for recoil. Mark's tone never sharpened. That was the point. "I don't need you to sign anything," Mark said at last, eyes flicking toward the burned foundation and back. "I just need you to come up short." The words landed with the weight of inevitability rather than cruelty. Mark explained that his firm couldn't purchase the property outright. Conflict of interest, procedural walls, but they would be present at auction. Waiting? Patient? David understood then that legality could be just as merciless as a bullet if aimed with care. Mark added one detail, almost as an aside. Years earlier, members of Sarah's family had tried to sell the land quietly, assuming it would pass through channels, like any other asset. Lucas Reed had intervened. Letters, objections, delays. He had forced the process to stall long enough that nothing moved before his death. Mark shrugged lightly, as if acknowledging a worthy opponent. He believed in what this place was supposed to be, he said. Belief doesn't stop the calendar. When Mark left, the dust hung in the air longer than it should have. David walked the perimeter alone, counting steps without meaning to, the way he used to measure distance under fire. 90 days translated into meals, into hours, into the slow bleed of time he did not have. He thought of Lucas's journal, of unfinished forms and good intentions that never learned the language of deadlines. He thought of Sarah's letters and the years stolen without consequence. The pattern was clear now. Delay was the enemy's favorite weapon. That evening, Harold Boone came by, leaning on his cane, eyes narrowing as David explained. Harold listened, then shook his head once. "That's how they do it," he said. "Clean, legal, quiet." He didn't offer solutions. Veterans like Harold knew the danger of false hope. He only reminded David that auctions didn't care about purpose, only payment. David sat on the step of the shed long after dark, the ledger open in his lap, numbers refusing to bend. Max pressed close, solid warmth against David's knee. The fear came then, not of losing dirt and wire and ash, but of letting a promise die on a technicality. Mark had been honest. The land wouldn't be taken by force. It would vanish on schedule. David closed the book, breath steadying as resolve replaced panic. 90 days was a countdown, yes, but it was also time. And time, unlike belief, could be used. David did not run. Fear still lived in his chest, but it no longer dictated movement. 90 days demanded action, not despair. He began with what he knew best: structure, discipline, usefulness. The old storage shed became his first objective. Using salvaged lumber and tools borrowed from Joel's workshop, David reinforced beams, replaced rotting boards, and sealed gaps against wind and snow. His movements were precise, economical, shaped by years of military engineering work done under pressure. Neighbors noticed that he never rushed, never cut corners. He worked as if the building mattered because it would be depended on. Word traveled quietly. A rancher asked if David could repair a collapsed fence. An elderly widow needed her porch steps stabilized. David accepted payment in fuel, food, or nothing at all, depending on the person. He treated every job the same. Max accompanied him everywhere, now older than 7, muzzle lightly dusted with gray, but still alert and steady. The Yapme dog watched strangers carefully, but once David trusted someone, Max followed suit. For people in town, that mattered more than conversation. Within weeks, other veterans appeared. Some stayed briefly, others longer. One was Eric Dunn, a thin man in his early 30s with hollow eyes and restless hands, discharged after an IED injury, left him with chronic pain and no benefits. Another was Samuel Ortiz, broader, heavier, mid-40s, beard untrimmed, anger barely contained after losing his job and family post service. David didn't ask questions first. He taught them how to fix a door, how to brace a wall, how to make a place livable with limited resources. The land changed with them. It no longer looked abandoned. It looked used. Harold Boone returned one afternoon with a woman David hadn't met. Claire Whitman was in her late 50s, tall and lean, with steel-gray hair cut short and eyes that missed nothing. She dressed plainly, but her posture carried quiet authority. Claire explained she had spent decades working in veterans advocacy law before retiring to the area. She listened as David laid out everything: Lucas's journal, the unfinished application, the tax deadline. She asked for copies. Her voice was calm, practiced, the tone of someone used to fighting systems that preferred silence. 2 days later, Claire came back with confirmation. The application Lucas Reed had filed was real, properly drafted, and never legally denied. It had simply stalled. With the right filings, it could be reactivated. More importantly, once reactivated, the land qualified for provisional community use status tied to veteran services. During review, county law allowed suspension of auction proceedings. Time, at last, bent slightly. David felt the shift not as relief, but as weight redistributing. Paperwork mattered now. He gathered documents meticulously, following Claire's instructions without deviation. Nights were spent reading Lucas's journal again, this time not as memory, but as blueprint. The land's purpose was becoming visible, measurable, not shelter alone, but transition, a place where soldiers could relearn civilian ground without being discarded. When the provisional filing was submitted, David stood at the edge of the property with Max at his side, watching others work where emptiness once lived. The shed had lights now, powered by a repaired generator. Voices carried through open air. Laughter, short and cautious, but real. David understood then that he was no longer defending dirt. He was documenting proof of use, of value, of necessity. For the first time since the war, David wasn't surviving between losses. He was building something that could be defended in court, in records, in lives changed. The land was no longer waiting to be taken. It was busy. Winter arrived without negotiation. The Montana sky sealed itself shut, and snow came sideways, driven by a wind that howled like machinery tearing loose. David had prepared the shed as best he could, but that night preparation failed. The gusts found every weakness. Wood groaned. Tin rattled. When the wind struck just right, it sounded like incoming fire, and his body reacted before his mind could intervene. His breathing shortened, muscles locking as if waiting for commands that never came. The darkness pressed in, and the past answered. The storm dragged him backward through memory. The shriek of wind became rotor wash. The snap of boards became rifle cracks. David's hands shook, fingers clawing for something solid that wasn't there. His vision narrowed, sweat soaked his shirt despite the cold. Years of restraint collapsed into a single moment of panic. He told himself he needed air, distance, escape. The old reflex surfaced fully formed. Leave the position. Break contact. Survive. He reached for his coat, boots half on, the door already open to white chaos. That was when Max moved. The German Shepherd stepped directly into David's path, bracing his body sideways against the doorframe. At nearly 90 pounds, Max was all muscle and discipline, his black and tan coat dusted white within seconds. His ears pinned back against the wind, amber eyes locked on David's face. He did not bark. He did not retreat. He leaned in, firm, insistent, grounding. The force of the wind drove snow into Max's flank, and he absorbed it without flinching. Max pressed closer, lowering himself until his body blocked the worst of the cold, anchoring David in place. The dog's breathing was slow and deliberate, a rhythm David recognized from countless nights overseas when Max had been trained to calm others before they broke. Max's muzzle was flecked with gray now, his joints stiff in the cold, but his resolve was unchanged. He stayed there, weight steady, eyes never, leaving David as if daring him to abandon what they had. David slid down against the wall, the storm screaming inches away. He wrapped his arms around Max's neck, burying his face in thick fur that smelled of snow and oil and earth. He counted breaths the way he had been taught long ago. In, out, again. The flashbacks loosened their grip, retreating reluctantly. The silence that followed was not peace, but it was survivable. The night dragged on, hour by hour, wind battering the building, snow climbing higher, but David did not move. When dawn finally broke, the world lay buried. Fences vanished, paths erased. The shed stood half swallowed, but upright. David woke stiff and exhausted, Max still pressed against him, both alive. Outside, other veterans emerged from their shelters, shaken but present. The generator coughed and caught. Lights flickered on, voices called out. The place endured because someone had stayed. Standing in the pale morning, David understood the truth. The storm had forced into him. If he ran, Max would lose the only stability he had left. If he ran, the fragile structure of work, trust, and purpose would collapse. Staying was no longer about endurance. It was about responsibility. For the first time in years, David chose not to retreat from fear. He chose to remain exactly where the fight was. The letter arrived first, stamped and unremarkable, but its contents changed the land's future with quiet finality. County approval recognized the property as a community use site for veterans, its status converted to nonprofit under local statute. Taxes were reduced and restructured. The auction was canceled. Mark Halstead's firm withdrew without appeal. There was nothing left to wait for. David read the notice twice, then folded it carefully and set it beside Lucas's journal, understanding at last that paperwork could protect what belief alone could not. Work followed recognition. David converted the shed not into a symbol, but into shelter. He framed bunks from reclaimed timber, spaced wide enough for dignity, sturdy enough for winters that tested everything. He built a stove from welded scrap, its heat honest and constant. The kitchen held one long table, scarred by use within days. No sign marked the road. No announcements were made. People arrived because someone told them, and they stayed because no one asked them to leave. On a beam near the entrance, David carved the words slowly, each letter deliberate. If you made it back, you belong here. The wood bore the weight without complaint. Max aged into his role, his muzzle silvered fully now, hips stiff in the cold, but his posture remained unchanged. He lay at the door, eyes half-lidded, rising only when someone new crossed the threshold. He did not bark, he assessed. Those who entered learned quickly that passing the dog meant more than permission. It meant responsibility. At night, Max slept where the wind found the cracks first, body angled to break it. David watched him and learned again what loyalty looked like when it asked for nothing. Spring brought a visitor David did not expect. His son arrived alone, late afternoon light catching on the dust of the road. He was in his early 20s, tall and lean, like David had been at that age, with dark hair cut short and a jaw set in restraint, rather than anger. His eyes carried caution, not accusation. He did not offer apologies. He set his bag down, rolled his sleeves, and picked up a hammer from the workbench as if it had always been his to use. They worked side by side, measuring and cutting, building a small room off the shed for families passing through. Words were unnecessary. The sound of nails driven straight did enough talking. The land changed shape with the season. Fences straightened. Paths formed where none had been. Veterans came and went. Some stayed a night, some a month. Some found their footing and left with plans folded into their pockets. David kept records now, not for control, but for continuity. Claire Whitman visited once, nodded at the ledger, and said nothing more. It was enough. At dusk the fire burned low and steady. The shelter held quiet conversations and unguarded sleep. David stood at the edge of the property, Max at his feet, the carved words catching the last light. He thought of Lucas. Read and promises delayed, of Sarah and letters returned unopened, of nights when leaving felt like the only skill left. The land had not healed him by magic. It had given him work worth finishing. When the wind rose, it carried voices instead of fear. David did not move. This place no longer asked him to survive. It asked him to stay. Sometimes what we call survival is actually grace in disguise. When the world closes every door, God leaves one light on, quiet, steady, enough to guide us home. If this story touched you, please share it, leave a comment, and subscribe. May God bless you, protect you, and remind you that you are never forgotten.